The first time Eliza Crane looked at her own reflection in the cracked mirror above the wash basin at the Dusty Creek boarding house, she did not see what others saw. She only saw every scar the world had left on her. It was the spring of 1878, and the town of Redemption, Texas sat baking under a sun so fierce it bleached the color from everything it touched. The wooden storefronts, the packed dirt streets, the faces of the people who had come west hoping to find something better than what they had left behind. Eliza had come west for exactly that reason, though she would not have admitted it to anyone who asked. She had packed what little remained of her life into a single leather satchel and boarded a stagecoach in Memphis, Tennessee, leaving behind a family that had made her feel small, a town that had made her feel invisible, and a man who had made her feel like nothing at all. She was 24 years old, with dark chestnut hair that she kept pulled back in a practical knot at the nape of her neck, and eyes so dark a brown they appeared almost black when the light was low. She had a wide, earnest mouth and strong hands from years of work, and a way of holding her shoulders slightly forward, as if she were always bracing for something unpleasant to arrive. The women back in Memphis had called her plain. The man she had nearly married, a banker's son named Gerald Whitmore who had fine features and no heart, had confirmed it once too many times with a careless remark here, a dismissive look there, until she had believed it the way you believe something you have heard said enough times that you stop questioning whether it is true. So Eliza arrived in Redemption, Texas with a cracked heart and a bruised sense of herself, carrying an advertisement she had answered 3 weeks prior. A rancher named Thaddeus Cole had placed notice in the Memphis Gazette seeking a schoolteacher for the small settlement school that served the children of the surrounding ranches and farms. The pay was modest, the accommodations basic, but it included room and board at the town boarding house and the promise of steady, honest work. Eliza had a schoolteacher's certificate from the Memphis Ladies' Academy, and she had spent 2 years teaching the children of wealthy Memphis families before Gerald Whitmore had swept her into his orbit and then discarded her like something he had grown bored of. She needed to start over. She needed somewhere that did not know her name. Redemption seemed as good a place as any. The stagecoach rolled into town on a Tuesday afternoon in April, kicking up a red-brown cloud of dust that settled over everything like a fine powder. Eliza stepped down from the coach with her satchel clutched in both hands and looked up and down the main street, a dry goods store, a saloon with a crooked sign, a church at the far end with a white steeple gone slightly gray, a livery stable, a sheriff's office, and a scattering of other establishments pressed together like the town was trying to conserve warmth despite the heat. The boarding house was easy enough to find. It sat on the east side of the main street with a cheerful sign that read, Mrs. Pearl Hawthorne's boarding establishment, clean rooms, good meals, no trouble. Mrs. Hawthorne herself met Eliza at the door. She was a stout woman of 50 with silver-streaked hair and bright, clever eyes that took inventory of a person in about 3 seconds. She looked Eliza over once, nodded as if some private decision had been settled, and said, "You'll be the new schoolteacher then. Come in out of that sun before it cooks you." That was how Eliza came to be standing at the cracked mirror above the wash basin in room 4 of the Dusty Creek boarding house on her first evening in Redemption, studying her own face in the fractured glass. The crack ran diagonally across the lower right portion, splitting her chin and jaw into 2 mismatched halves. She thought it was fitting, somehow. She pressed her fingertips to the glass and leaned in closer, cataloging what she saw with the detached precision of someone assessing damage. A nose that was straight but slightly too broad, a jaw that was too strong for fashionable prettiness, dark circles under her eyes from 3 days on a stagecoach, a small scar along her left cheekbone from a childhood fall off a fence. She stepped back and said aloud to no one, "Well, Eliza, you certainly are not beautiful." Then she straightened her spine, pulled her jacket smooth, and went down to supper. The next morning she met Thaddeus Cole, the rancher who had hired her without ever meeting her in person, having conducted the entire arrangement by letter. He came into town to welcome her properly and to walk her over to the schoolhouse, which sat at the edge of town near a cottonwood grove. He was a man of about 50, weathered and wide-shouldered, with a silver mustache and the careful, deliberate manner of someone who had spent a great deal of his life making responsible decisions. He shook her hand firmly and said he was pleased she had come, that the children had been without regular schooling for the better part of 8 months since the last teacher had left to get married in San Antonio. "There are 14 students in all," he told her as they walked, "ranging from 6 years to 15. Some of them are rough around the edges, but they're good children. You'll have no trouble from them if you hold firm from the first day." Eliza said she understood, and she did. She had handled difficult students before. The schoolhouse was a single room with a plank floor, 10 rough-hewn benches, a wood stove in the corner, a chalkboard on the front wall, and 6 windows that let in the prairie light in long golden strips. It smelled of chalk dust and old wood, and something faintly sweet that she eventually identified as the wild prairie flowers that had pushed through the ground just outside the east window. She stood in the center of the room and felt, for the first time in many months, that she was standing in the right place. She opened the school the following Monday. 14 students arrived in various states of readiness, some scrubbed and eager, others muddy-booted and suspicious. By the end of the first week she had established order, had won the cautious respect of the older students, and had charmed the younger ones completely with her genuine interest in what they had to say. Mrs. Hawthorne told her over supper on Friday evening that the whole town was already speaking well of her. Eliza smiled and said that was kind, and helped herself to more biscuits. She was beginning, tentatively, to breathe again. It was in the second week of April that she met James Calloway. She had gone to the dry goods store on a Saturday morning to purchase chalk and a new piece of slate pencil, and she was standing at the counter waiting for Mr. Dobbins, the store owner, to finish with another customer when the door behind her opened and let in a gust of warm, dry air and the smell of leather and horses, and something faintly like the open prairie itself. She did not turn around immediately. She was reading the labels on the jars of patent medicine arranged on the shelf behind the counter with idle curiosity, and the new arrival was apparently in no great hurry either, because he said simply, "Morning, Dobbins," in a voice that was low and unhurried and easy, like water moving over smooth stones. "Morning, Calloway," Mr. Dobbins said, still measuring out the flour for the customer ahead of Eliza. "Be with you directly." Eliza turned then, partly out of politeness, and partly because she had the schoolteacher's habit of wanting to know who was in the room with her. She found herself looking at a man of perhaps 28 or 29, who was leaning against the door frame in that particular way, that men who spend most of their time outdoors tend to lean against things entirely without self-consciousness, as if he had decided the door frame was a perfectly reasonable thing to put one's shoulder against, and saw no reason to revisit that decision. He was tall, with the kind of leanness that comes from hard work rather than deprivation, and he wore a dark hat with a brim that shaded the upper part of his face, though not enough to conceal the fact that his eyes were a remarkable shade of gray-green, the color of sage after rain. He had a strong jaw shadowed with several days' worth of dark stubble, and a scar that ran along the outer edge of his left eyebrow, thin and pale against tanned skin. He was not what you would call conventionally handsome in the way that Gerald Whitmore had been conventionally handsome. He was better than that in the way that real things are always better than decorative ones. He met her eyes when she looked at him, and he nodded once in greeting, polite and straightforward. "Morning, ma'am." "Good morning," she said, and turned back to the patent medicine shelf, because she was not in the habit of staring. She paid for her chalk and her slate pencil and gathered her small parcel and was halfway to the door when Mr. Dobbins said, "Miss Crane, have you met James Calloway? He runs the Broken Spur Ranch just east of town. One of your students is his young Thomas." She turned again, and James Calloway had pushed off from the door frame and was looking at her with the same direct, easy attention as before. He extended his hand. She shook it. His hand was broad and calloused and warm. "Thomas talks about school every evening now," he said. "Before you came, he talked about school the way people talk about dentist appointments. So whatever you are doing, it is working." Eliza laughed, genuinely and without thinking about it, which surprised her a little because it had been some time since she had laughed without thinking about it first. "Thomas is a very bright boy," she said. "He asks excellent questions." "He asks too many questions according to most people," James said, and there was something in the way he said it, not defensive exactly, but firm, like someone who has made peace with standing between a person they care about and a world that doesn't always understand that person. "I'm glad he's found a teacher who doesn't think so." "Questions are how we learn," Eliza said simply. He looked at her for a moment, not in the way that made her feel like she was being assessed, but in the way that made her feel like she was being listened to, which was different and considerably rarer in her experience. Then he said, "That's a good answer," and she was not sure if he meant it as a compliment or simply as an honest observation, but either way it landed somewhere warm in her chest, and she carried it with her out of the store and back down the main street to the boarding house. Thomas Calloway was 9 years old, and he was indeed bright in that particular, slightly wild way of children who have spent more time with horses and open sky than with other children. He had his uncle's gray-green eyes. James was his uncle. She learned from Mrs. Hawthorne that evening over supper, not his father, though James had been raising the boy for 3 years since Thomas's parents had been lost to a fever epidemic that had swept through the county in the spring of 1875. Thomas had a habit of arriving at school with some small natural object in his pocket, a peculiarly shaped stone, a shed snakeskin, a blue-gray feather he insisted belonged to a crane, and presenting it to Eliza at the start of the morning with great ceremony, as if paying a toll. She kept each object in a line along the windowsill, and they became a kind of informal science exhibit that the other children gathered around with interest before school began each day. She learned about James Calloway in the piecemeal, sideways way that small towns impart information, through Mrs. Hawthorne's cheerful commentary at supper, through offhand remarks from Mr. Dobbins, through what Thomas himself let fall in unguarded moments during the school day. James had come to Texas from Kentucky at the age of 22, had worked as a cattle hand on the Thaddeus Cole Ranch for 2 years before saving enough to put a down payment on the Broken Spur, a modest spread of about 800 acres east of town. He had built the ranch house with his own hands and 2 hired men. He had worked the land through drought and flood and the particular loneliness of the Texas frontier, and he had done it with the same unhurried steadiness that seemed to characterize everything about him. He had never married, which Mrs. Hawthorne noted with the pointed significance of a woman who considered this state of affairs to be a problem that wanted correcting. He had a girl he was courting, Mrs. Hawthorne said one evening in May, passing the potatoes across the table to Eliza with the air of someone sharing important intelligence. "About 4 years ago. Sarah Briggs from the Briggs farm south of here. Pretty girl. But her family moved north to Colorado and she went with them, and he didn't follow. Nobody quite knows why." Eliza said that was a shame, in the noncommittal tone she used when she did not want to encourage further speculative discussion, and Mrs. Hawthorne looked at her with those bright, clever eyes and said nothing more, which somehow felt worse than if she had kept talking. Eliza saw James Calloway on Saturday mornings when he came into town for supplies, and sometimes on Sunday evenings when the Cole Ranch and surrounding families gathered at the church for what passed as a community social people, bringing food and news, and staying for 2 or 3 hours of music and conversation in the warm, lamplit interior. He would come in with Thomas at his side, hat in hand, and he had a way of moving through a room that was not showy but was somehow notable, the way a deep river is notable even when it is not making much noise. He always found her, Or perhaps she always found him. She was never entirely certain which it was, only that within the first 20 minutes of any social gathering they had somehow ended up in conversation, standing together near the refreshment table, or in the doorway where the night air came in cool and smelling of sage and dust, talking about things that felt important and easy at the same time. She told him about Memphis, about her schoolteacher's certificate, about the particular pleasure she took in watching a child have the moment when something clicked into understanding. He told her about the ranch, about the particular poetry of an early morning on the Texas plains when the light came up slow and pink and everything was still. He told her about Thomas, about the weight of that responsibility and the particular joy of it, how the boy had cracked open his chest in ways he had not expected and made him understand things about love that he could not have articulated before. She listened to him the way she had always listened, completely and carefully, because it was the only way she knew how. And she noticed, gradually, that he listened to her the same way. In the third week of May, something happened that tilted the careful, measured thing that was growing between them into new territory. It was a Wednesday afternoon, and school had let out at 3 o'clock as it always did. Eliza was in the habit of staying an extra half hour to prepare the next day's lessons, and she was sitting at her desk near the window when she heard a commotion outside, raised voices, and the sound of something heavy being dragged. She went to the window and saw 4 of the older boys from school, not her students, but boys of 16 and 17 from a neighboring settlement, harassing Thomas Calloway on the road outside. They had his hat and were tossing it between them in that particular, ugly way of older boys demonstrating their dominance over a smaller one. Thomas was white-faced and rigid, not crying, but holding himself in that tight, vibrating way that is sometimes worse than tears. Eliza was outside before she had consciously decided to move. "Give the boy his hat," she said, and her voice came out level and clear and carrying, the schoolteacher's voice she had developed in Memphis and refined further in the 6 weeks she had been in Redemption. She was not a large woman, but she had learned that authority lived in the spine and the voice, not in the size of the person. The boys looked at her with the dismissive contempt that certain young men reserved for women who spoke to them without invitation, but she held their gaze with absolute steadiness, until the one holding the hat dropped it simply because holding it had become somehow uncomfortable. Thomas picked it up from the ground and put it back on his head with great dignity. "Go home," Eliza said to the older boys, and they went, muttering. She walked Thomas back to where his horse was tied at the livery stable, listening while he told her, with careful composure, that those boys thought he was strange because he brought rocks and feathers to school and asked too many questions, and that they had said his uncle was going to be stuck raising a peculiar orphan forever and serve him right. His voice cracked slightly on the word orphan, the only moment when the composure faltered. "Those boys," Eliza said with measured precision, "are afraid of people who are interested in the world because being interested in the world requires courage. They don't have it yet. Perhaps they will when they grow up." She paused. "And as for what they said about your uncle is raising a remarkable boy. Anyone with eyes can see that." Thomas looked up at her with those gray-green eyes and said, "He thinks you're remarkable too. He told Thaddeus Cole at the fence line last week that the school was lucky to have you." Eliza felt something shift in her chest, warm and slightly terrifying, and she said, "Well, that was kind of him," in the voice of someone who was busy pretending they had not just been thoroughly undone by the offhand remark of a 9-year-old. James found out what had happened by that evening. He came to the boarding house the next morning, a Thursday, before school started. He knocked on the front door and Mrs. Hawthorne showed him into the small parlor where Eliza was having her second cup of coffee before the walk to the schoolhouse, and he stood in the doorway with his hat in both hands and said, "Thomas told me what you did. I wanted to thank you properly." "There is nothing to thank me for," she said. "Any decent person would have done the same." "Most decent people were not there," he said. He was looking at her with that direct, clear attention of his, and she had the sudden, inconvenient awareness that she was not wearing her jacket over her blouse, that her hair was not yet entirely pinned up, that she was less armored than she usually was in the mornings when she came downstairs, and that none of this seemed to concern him in the slightest, which somehow concerned her more. "Thomas has a good deal of courage," he said. "He comes by it honestly, I think. He is a fine boy," she said. "He is going to grow into a fine man." Something in James's expression shifted, not toward sentiment exactly, but toward something raw and real that he quickly smoothed over, the way you smooth a hand over the surface of water to still it. He nodded once, and then he said, "Miss Crane, I was wondering if you might like to come out to the Broken Spur on Sunday. Thomas has been wanting to show you the hawk's nest on the East Ridge, and there are some books I thought might be useful for the school library. I have a small collection that I'm not using." He paused. "And the ride out is pleasant in the morning." She said yes before she had finished thinking about whether she should. Sunday was cloudless and warm, with a wind off the plains that smelled of grass and something sweet she could not name. James came to collect her on horseback at 9 in the morning, bringing a well-mannered roan mare for her to ride, and they rode east out of town along the trail that wound through scattered stands of mesquite and live oak before opening out onto the broad, golden plain, where the Broken Spur ranch sat low against the horizon, with the blue distance of the Texas hills behind it. The ranch house was a single-story structure of stone and heavy timber, solid and unpretentious, with a covered porch that ran the length of the front and a kitchen garden in the back showing the first ambitious green shoots of spring vegetables. Thomas was waiting on the porch steps and jumped up when he saw them, barely containing the energy of a child who has been waiting patiently for exactly as long as he can stand before it becomes impossible. He showed her everything. The hawk's nest on the East Ridge, where a pair of red-tailed hawks had built an elaborate platform of sticks in the cleft of a rock outcropping. The creek bed where Thomas had found most of his stone collection. The barn with its comfortable darkness and the smell of hay and horses, and the 2 ranch dogs who pressed against her legs and sighed with canine contentment. The kitchen garden, which Thomas had planted himself with James's instruction, and which he explained to her with the intensity of a scientist presenting significant findings. James walked with them through all of it, mostly quiet, letting Thomas narrate, stepping in occasionally to add something or to correct a detail with the easy, unpatronizing manner he had with the boy. But she was aware of him constantly, the way you are aware of something that generates warmth, not necessarily by looking at it directly, but by the fact that you know exactly where it is. They had lunch on the porch, cold chicken and fresh bread, and apple butter that James had made himself over the winter, which she found somehow more surprising and touching than if he had hired someone to do it. Thomas fell asleep in the porch rocking chair mid-afternoon, exhausted from the morning's explorations, and Eliza and James sat in the afternoon quiet with their coffee, and talked in the lowered voices of people being careful not to wake a sleeping child. He told her about Kentucky, about the farm where he had grown up, the third of 4 boys, the family's gradual inability to hold onto the land through years of difficult seasons. He had come west because there had simply been no future for him in the old place, and because something in him had always wanted the open spaces, the rawness, the sense of building something from nothing. She told him about Memphis, about her family, about the way her mother had always said she had her father's build and her father's jaw, and none of the softness that was considered the proper inheritance of daughters. She told him about Gerald Whitmore with more candor than she had intended, because something about the afternoon, the stillness, the fact of Thomas sleeping peacefully 3 feet away, had lowered her guard without her permission. "He told you that you were not beautiful," James said, and there was nothing dramatic in the way he said it, no righteous anger, just a kind of careful, assessing attention, as if he was checking the fact against something in his own perception and finding a discrepancy. She shrugged, which was not an answer, but it was what she had. He implied it, mostly by comparison. He had a way of speaking about other women, always complimentary, always detailed, and somehow I was never among the ones he spoke about that way. She looked out at the yard, at the dry grass and the distant silver shimmer of the creek through the mesquite. After long enough, you stop questioning whether it is true and start accepting it as information. James was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That seems like a cruelty performed so gradually you would never notice it happening until it had already happened." She turned to look at him. He was looking at her with that directness she had come to recognize, and it was still, even now, slightly unnerving in its honesty. "Yes," she said. "That is exactly what it was." He nodded once. He did not say anything reassuring or meaninglessly complimentary, which she had half expected and would have resented. He simply acknowledged what she had said with the full weight of someone who had heard it, and that was better than any reassurance would have been. They rode back to town in the early evening with Thomas up behind James on his horse, half asleep and clutching James's jacket with one small hand. The sky was doing something extraordinary in the west, long streaks of orange and deep rose, and a purple that seemed almost too saturated to be real, piled up above the horizon in great theatrical layers. She rode alongside James and watched the sky and did not feel the need to fill the silence, which was itself a remarkable thing. At the boarding house steps, he helped her down from the mare and handed her the parcel of books he had promised, and she thought for a moment that he was going to say something, because there was a brief pause in which he seemed to be assembling words. But Thomas chose that moment to topple sideways on the horse with a sleepy protest, and James caught him without looking, purely by instinct, with a hand that had evidently been anticipating this development. He settled the boy upright and the moment passed and he said only, "Good evening, Miss Crane." "Thank you for coming. Thank you for having me," she said. She went inside and carried the books upstairs and sat on the edge of her bed and held her own hands together in her lap and breathed carefully, the way you breathe when you are trying to be rational about something that does not particularly want to be rational. June came in hot and bright and relentless. The school term was due to end at the beginning of July, since the children were needed for summer work on the farms and ranches, and Eliza found herself thinking about that fact with a kind of anxious attention she did not entirely understand. The school term ending did not mean she would leave. Her arrangement with Thaddeus Cole was for a full year, September through September, and she had the boarding house room and no particular place to go back to even if she had wanted to, but the school term ending meant the daily rhythm she had built for herself would change, and the daily rhythm included certain things she had come to rely on. Thomas came to school every day. James came to town every Saturday. The church socials happened every other Sunday. These were the coordinates of her week, and she was honest enough with herself, by mid-June, to admit that some of those coordinates mattered more than others. She was deeply attracted to James Calloway, and she was frightened of that fact in the direct, honest way that someone is frightened of stepping off a ledge after they have once stepped off a ledge, and survived it only barely. She confided this to Mrs. Hawthorne on a warm June evening, when the two of them were sitting on the boarding house porch after supper, watching the evening settle over the main street of Redemption. Mrs. Hawthorne received the information with the satisfied composure of someone who has been watching something develop and is gratified to have their perception confirmed. "He is a good man," Mrs. Hawthorne said. "One of the genuinely good ones, which is rarer than people like to pretend. He would be good for you." "That is not the question," Eliza said, picking at a loose thread on her skirt with studied attention. "The question is whether I would be suitable." She stopped, because the sentence did not go anywhere useful. "Whether you're good enough for him, is that what you were going to say?" Mrs. Hawthorne's voice was gentle but direct. "Eliza, that is the wrong question entirely. The right question is whether you want him, and whether he wants you, and the answer to both of those is visible from a considerable distance." Eliza said nothing. That man has rearranged his Saturday mornings to come into town in time to encounter you at the dry goods store," Mrs. Hawthorne said. "He did not used to come to town until mid-afternoon. Mrs. Dobbins told me. He has been coming at 9 o'clock since the week after you arrived." Eliza looked at her hands. "That does not prove he brought you out to his ranch," Mrs. Hawthorne said. "He has not had a woman out to that ranch in 4 years." Eliza was quiet for a long moment. The evening light lay warm and amber along the street, and somewhere down the block 2 children were running with a kite that had caught in the early evening breeze and was lifting improbably high. She watched the kite and thought about steps and ledges and the particular courage required to walk off one willingly. "I am afraid," she said, which was the most honest thing she had said to anyone in a very long time. "Good," Mrs. Hawthorne said, without a trace of unkindness. "It means it matters." The following Saturday James came into town at 9 o'clock, as he apparently had been doing since the week of her arrival, and found her at the dry goods store, as he apparently had been planning to. They walked together to the church after, where the circuit preacher was holding a discussion about the proposed new school building. Thaddeus Cole had organized a town meeting on the subject. It was a warm morning and the church windows were thrown open and the smell of the prairie came through in slow, fragrant waves. Afterward, walking back down the main street, James said with no particular preamble, "I would like to take you to dinner, Miss Crane. The hotel dining room on Friday evening if you are agreeable." She looked at him. He met her eyes with that level steadiness. "Yes," she said, "I am agreeable." He smiled then, the full version of his smile rather than the controlled partial version he usually deployed, and it rearranged his face entirely in a way she was completely unprepared for. "Good," he said. 7 o'clock then. She told herself on the walk back to the boarding house that she was going to be sensible about this. She was not going to read more into a dinner invitation than was meant. She was not going to construct elaborate futures from a single meal. She was 24 years old and she had been grievously wrong about a person before, and she was going to be careful and measured and adult about the whole business. She was none of those things. She changed her dress 3 times on Friday evening before Mrs. Hawthorne came upstairs, stood in the doorway of room 4, looked at her and said, "The blue one. Stay with the blue." The hotel dining room was the finest establishment in Redemption, which was not saying a great deal. It had 6 tables, 2 oil lamps, white tablecloths that were somewhat gray from repeated washing, and a cook who did remarkable things with beef and onions. But it was quiet and warm and it smelled of good food, and James was already there when she arrived, standing to greet her, and something in the way he looked at her when she walked in, a brief, unmistakable clarity of attention, as if someone had pulled a curtain back, made her forget entirely what she had planned to say first. They ate slowly and talked for 3 hours. They talked about books and about the territory and about Thomas and about the school building proposal and about what the railroad coming through meant for the region and about Kentucky and Memphis and about what it meant to build a life somewhere that was still in the process of becoming itself. They talked past the other diners' departures and past the point when the cook appeared in the doorway to blow out one of the lamps and cleared his throat meaningfully, and James paid the bill and they went out into the warm June night. The main street was quiet. A few lights still burned in the saloon at the far end. Stars were out in extraordinary numbers. The Milky Way laid across the sky like a broad, pale river. They stood on the hotel steps and looked up at it, and James said, "I have been watching this sky for 6 years and I am still not accustomed to it." "It is very large," she said. He laughed, a low, warm sound. "Yes, that is what it is." They stood there for a moment longer, and then he turned to look at her, and she turned to look at him, and they were close, closer than they had been. And she was aware of everything, the warmth of the evening, the distant sound from the saloon, the smell of dust and night air and him, and the fact that she had built a very careful wall around the interior of herself after Gerald Whitmore had knocked down the original one, and she was not entirely sure the new wall was as sturdy as she had wanted it to be. she said before she could stop herself. "I should tell you something." He waited. "I have been told," she said, looking back up at the stars rather than at him because it was easier, "a sufficient number of times and by sufficient people, that I am not particularly, that I am not beautiful." She paused. "I want you to know that because I would rather you know it before rather than have you think I believe otherwise." Or she stopped, because she was not quite sure what point she was actually making, only that it felt necessary to say it, to put it out into the air where it could not ambush her later. There was a pause, and then James laughed, not unkindly, not dismissively. A real laugh, genuine and warm and somewhat astonished, as if she had said something that surprised him in the most specific possible way. She turned to look at him, ready to be wounded, and he was shaking his head slightly with an expression that was half amused and entirely affectionate. "Eliza," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name. "I have eyes, don't I?" She stared at him. He held her gaze, steady and serious despite the laughter that was still warm around the edges of his expression. "I have been looking at you for 2 months," he said. "I have formed my own opinion. And whoever told you otherwise was either not paying attention or was deliberately trying to make you small. Neither of those things has anything to do with what I see." She did not know what to say. She was not sure she could say anything because something had happened in her chest that was warm and enormous and slightly overwhelming, and she was working hard at composure. "You are remarkable to look at," he said plainly. "And I am aware that you do not believe me. That is fine. You do not have to believe me on my word, but I would like the opportunity to say it often enough that eventually the evidence becomes undeniable." She looked at him for a long moment. The stars were very bright. Down the street the saloon was gradually quieting. "That," she said finally carefully, "is a great deal of confidence." "I am a patient man," he said simply. She could not keep the smile from coming. It arrived without her permission, the full, unguarded version that she did not often let people see. He saw it, and his expression shifted into something that she would replay for the next several nights, with the detailed attention of someone trying to understand exactly why it had done what it had done to the inside of her chest. He walked her to the boarding house steps and said good night, and she went inside and stood in the hallway for a moment with her hand against the wall and thought, with a kind of clear, unfrightened certainty that was new. This is the real thing. July arrived and the school term ended. The children dispersed to their summer chores with the barely contained relief of youth, and Thomas Calloway presented Eliza with a final specimen from his windowsill collection, a small, perfect piece of rose quartz that he had found in the creek bed, and told her solemnly that she was the best teacher he had ever had, which lost some of its mathematical force since she was also the only teacher he clearly remembered. But she accepted it in the spirit intended, and was more moved than she let on. She spent the summer reading and helping Mrs. Hawthorne and taking long walks on the prairie in the early mornings, when the heat was not yet fully arrived, and the light was the color of honey, and everything felt possible in the particular way that mornings do. She helped with the preparations for the 4th of July celebration that Redemption organized on the town square, a modest affair involving a picnic and a patriotic speech by the mayor and a somewhat disorganized but enthusiastic band. And she stood next to James during the fireworks, their arms almost touching in the dark, and felt the warm weight of his nearness like a second source of heat alongside the Texas summer. He came to see her twice a week now, or she saw him in the natural course of the week. There were more rides, more evenings on the boarding house porch after supper with Mrs. Hawthorne conveniently finding something to do indoors. There were more of those long, ranging conversations that covered everything and went nowhere particular, and were somehow the most satisfying conversations she had ever been in. He brought her wildflowers once, not presented with ceremony or self-consciousness, but held out casually, as if he had simply picked them because they were there, and she was here, and the logical thing was to put one with the other. She put them in the water glass on her windowsill, and they lasted 4 days, and she was obscurely sad when they went. He kissed her for the first time on a Thursday evening in late July, on the boarding house porch after a supper he had joined at Mrs. Hawthorne's invitation, when the last of the light had gone from the sky and the first stars were appearing. It was not impulsive, nothing about James Calloway was impulsive, but it was not tentative either. He was a man who knew what he meant, and he meant this. His hand came to rest against her jaw, warm and careful, and he looked at her for a moment as if asking a question, and she answered it by not moving away, and then he kissed her with the same steady, unhurried attention he brought to everything, and she kissed him back with a thoroughness that surprised them both. When they separated, he kept his hand against her jaw for a moment longer, his thumb tracing the edge of her cheekbone, the one with the small childhood scar, and he looked at her in the dim light with an expression she could not quite name, only feel. "I should have done that sooner," he said. "You did it when you meant to," she said, because she believed that about him, and it was true. He smiled, slow and warm. "Yes," he said, "I did." August unfolded in long, gold-lit days. She settled into the altered reality of being a woman in love with a man who loved her back with equal measure, and absolutely no ambiguity, which she had not known before, and which turned out to be an entirely different experience from the guessing and second-guessing and reading of insufficient signals that had characterized her time with Gerald Whitmore. James was not a man who left things unclear. He said what he thought, and he thought what he said, and he looked at her always as if she were something worth looking at, and after enough weeks of this she found, to her own cautious astonishment, that she was beginning to believe it. Not all at once, not in a single revelatory moment, but gradually, the way that the warmth comes back into a hand that has been cold for a long time, not dramatically, not all in a rush, but in small degrees that add up over time to something you can feel everywhere. She told him, one afternoon in early August, sitting on a flat rock by the creek at the Broken Spur, while Thomas conducted some elaborate scientific experiment involving sticks and the current about 20 yards downstream, that she was afraid of getting it wrong. Not of him specifically, of herself. Of the possibility that the part of her that had misjudged before could misread this too. He listened to all of it with his complete attention, and then he said, "The fact that you are asking the question is evidence that you are not going to get it wrong." She looked at him. "Gerald Whitmore," he said, with no particular heat, "was not asking that question. He was not worried about whether he had understood you correctly. The fact that you are sitting here worried about whether you are seeing clearly is exactly the reason I am fairly confident you are." She thought about that for a long time afterward. In September, school began again. The schoolhouse smelled of chalk and wood and those same wild prairie flowers at the east window, and 14 students arrived on the first morning in various states of summer brown, slightly taller versions of themselves, and Eliza stood at the front of the room in the long morning light and felt the particular happiness of being exactly where you belong. Thomas had grown at least an inch and had acquired, over the summer at the ranch, a seriousness of purpose that sat well on him, not a diminishing of his curiosity but a deepening of it, a new steadiness behind the questions. He presented her on the first morning with a September specimen, a small fossil he had found in the creek bank, which was by some distance the finest thing he had ever brought to the windowsill, and which caused 3 separate students to cluster around it at recess with genuine scientific excitement. James proposed on a Saturday in October. He did not do it with fanfare or elaborate staging, which she would have suspected and found uncomfortable. He did it on horseback, which suited them both, riding south of town on one of the long, easy rides they had developed the habit of taking in the late Saturday afternoons when the work of the week was done, and the evening was still 2 hours off. They had reached the top of a low hill that looked out over a broad curve of the Llano River, silver in the October light, with the cottonwoods along the bank gone to brilliant yellow, and the sky behind them the deep, saturated blue of autumn. He stopped the horses and looked out at it for a moment, and then turned to look at her and said, "I want to marry you, Eliza. I want to build a life with you at the Broken Spur, and I want Thomas to grow up knowing that this is what a family looks like. I want to watch you become whoever you are going to be next, and I want to do that every day for the rest of my life." He paused. "If you are willing." She looked at the river and the yellow trees and the enormous October sky, and then she looked at him, and she felt the old fear rise briefly and then pass, the way a cloud passes across the sun, real for a moment, and then gone, and the warmth still there underneath. "I am willing," she said. He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand in both of his and held it, and she felt the warmth of him run all the way up her arm and settle somewhere near her heart, which had been cold for so long and was not cold anymore. They were married on a Saturday in late November, in the Redemption Church with its white steeple gone slightly gray, by the circuit preacher who had made a special scheduling provision at James's earnest written request. Mrs. Hawthorne cried, cheerfully and without apology. Thaddeus Cole stood as James's witness and told Eliza afterward that she had made a wiser man than him, which was high praise from the most careful man in the county. Thomas stood beside James in a good jacket that was slightly too large, and held the ring with both hands and the concentrated solemnity of someone entrusted with a sacred object, which he was. The church was full of the people of Redemption, the Dobbins, the Coles, the other ranch families, the parents of her students, people who had arrived in this rough and beautiful corner of the world carrying their own histories and their own losses and their own small daily acts of courage, people who had found, in the shared work of building something in a hard land, the kind of community that makes individuals into something larger. Eliza stood at the front of it all and looked at James and thought that a year ago she had stepped off a stagecoach in a strange town with a cracked heart and a leather satchel, and no very clear idea of what came next. What came next was this warm, full, improbable thing. The preacher spoke the words and they spoke theirs back, and when he said James could kiss his bride, James took her face in both hands with a gentleness that was also somehow entirely confident, and kissed her, as if making a statement he intended to stand behind for the rest of his life, which he did. They settled into the Broken Spur, the way two people settle into a life together, when they have both spent long enough alone to understand what the company of the right person is actually worth, with gratitude and attention, and the kind of daily care that looks unremarkable from the outside, and is in fact everything. Eliza learned the rhythms of the ranch, the early mornings, the particular language of horses and cattle and seasons, the way the Texas plains changed face with each turning of the year. James learned the rhythms of her need for quiet in the mornings before the world fully arrived, the way she read with the same total absorption she brought to conversation, the way she laughed at her own jokes a full second after she told them, which delighted him entirely. She continued teaching through the winter and into the spring. She rode to school in the mornings on the roan mare James had given her and rode home in the afternoons, and sometimes he was at the fence line when she came up the track and raised a hand and she raised one back, and it was a small thing, and she carried it with her through the whole evening. Thomas flourished. With both of them present and steady, he grew into the serious, curious, warm-hearted boy that had always been waiting inside the slightly solitary child who had brought rocks and feathers to school. He was reading at a level 2 grades above his age by the following spring. He had decided he wanted to be a naturalist, and had begun keeping a detailed journal of his observations about the creek fauna and the prairie birds, illustrated with careful pencil sketches that showed a genuine, uncoached talent for it. Eliza and James consulted quietly together about what was available in terms of further education, and James wrote letters to an academy in Austin that was known for its natural science program. Winter became spring and spring became summer, and by the late summer of the following year, 1880, Eliza told James on a warm evening on the porch that they were going to have a child. He went very still for a moment, the way he sometimes did when something hit him at the core, not blank, but entirely concentrated, processing something that mattered too much for immediate expression. Then he reached out and put his hand over hers where it rested on the porch railing and looked at her with an expression that she had no words for, only the feeling it produced, which was of being seen and wanted and profoundly not alone. "Are you well?" he asked, practical first, which was him. "I am well," she said. He nodded once slowly. Then he said very quietly, "Good, good." And then he pulled her gently against his side and held her there and looked out at the evening. And she could feel the full weight of what he was feeling in the steadiness with which he held her. And she understood that this was what it meant to be loved by someone who expressed the deepest things through presence and steadiness rather than through speech. And she had never once in her life felt more loved. The boy was born in the spring of 1881, during a warm night in April that smelled of the wild prairie flowers beginning to bloom. James paced the kitchen with a thoroughness he would have denied if asked, while Mrs. Hawthorne, who had been at the Broken Spur for the week prior and would be staying another week after, managed the birth room with efficient competence. The ranch hand, a steady Tennessean named Calvin, sat on the porch steps and occasionally offered from the doorway that everything was surely going to be fine, which helped no one but him. The baby arrived just before dawn, with a voice that appeared to be in vigorous disagreement with the circumstances of his birth, and Mrs. Hawthorne came to the kitchen doorway and told James he could come in now, and James went in and found Eliza in the lamplight, exhausted and entirely brilliant, holding a son with dark hair and enormous dark eyes that were going to settle into gray-green when they decided on a color. And he sat on the edge of the bed and looked at them both and said nothing, because there was nothing adequate to say, and he was smart enough to know it. He put one broad, careful hand against the baby's head, so gently, and looked at Eliza with an expression she would keep in her memory for the rest of her life, open and wholly unguarded in a way he rarely was. Love without armor, which is the only kind that counts. They named the boy Henry James Calloway. Henry for James's father, who had worked hard for a land that had not ultimately been kind to him, and James because Eliza insisted on it even when he deflected. Thomas received his new cousin with the considered seriousness of a scientist, evaluating a new specimen, and the barely contained delight of a boy who had always wanted someone younger to teach things to. He presented the infant Henry with a piece of rose quartz from his collection, placed carefully on the blanket next to the sleeping baby, with the same ceremony he had once used presenting Eliza with her own piece of rose quartz in the schoolhouse. Eliza saw it and her throat tightened with love so sharp it was nearly painful. The school term of 1881 saw a new development. The new schoolhouse was finally built. Thaddeus Cole's proposal had gathered momentum and funding over the year and a half since the church meeting, and by September of 1881, the new building stood at the edge of the Cottonwood Grove larger, with glass windows and a proper floor, and 2 rooms instead of 1, which meant Eliza could properly divide the younger and older students and teach each group with more depth and precision. She stood in the new building on the first morning of term with the chalk dust already on her hands and the September light coming through the real glass windows in clean, clear panels, and she felt the same thing she had felt in the old schoolhouse on that first day, that she was standing in exactly the right place. The summer of 1882 brought drought. It arrived quietly in the way droughts do, not as a sudden catastrophe but as a gradual, creeping absence. Less rain than expected in April, then in May the creek dropping, then in June the grass going yellow earlier than it should, then in July the sky clamping down on the land with a dry, relentless heat that nothing moved under except at great cost. The ranch families of the Redemption area held together with the particular solidarity of communities that understand they will weather these things together or not at all. James pulled water from the deeper wells, moved the cattle to the less depleted pastures, made the careful calculations that farming and ranching in a hard country requires, and did not panic, which was the most useful thing he could do. Eliza organized the families of the school district in a practical assistance network, shared supplies, shared labor, the monitoring of which families were in most difficult circumstances, and the discreet management of aid in ways that preserved dignity. She had Mrs. Hawthorne's instinct for this and her mother's practicality, and her own schoolteacher's knowledge of exactly who had what and who needed what without making anyone feel they were being inventoried. The drought broke in September with 3 days of rain so thorough and determined that the creek flooded its banks, and the low field stood under 6 inches of water, and everyone simply stood in the rain and let it fall on them because it was such an enormous, immediate relief that dignity was beside the point. Thomas documented the entire event in his naturalist's journal with careful precision, and several very good drawings of the flooding creek. The autumn of 1882 was the most beautiful Eliza had seen since coming to Texas. The rains had turned the grass a saturated, almost impossible green, and the wild prairie flowers bloomed a second time in a flush of purple and gold that came up along the creek banks, and the edges of the broken spurs eastern field in great, fragrant drifts. She stood one morning in the east field in the early October light with Henry on her hip, 18 months old now, pulling at her hair with imperious determination, and looked at all that color against the broad blue of the Texas sky, and thought that she had come to this country looking for somewhere to start over and had found instead somewhere to arrive. James came out of the barn and walked across the field toward them, and Henry spotted him and made the particular urgent sound of a small child who has seen the person they want most, and James took him from Eliza's arms and tossed him up once gently, in the way that made Henry shriek with delight, and then settled him against his chest and put his other arm around Eliza's shoulders and stood with them both in the field of wildflowers and the October morning. "It is a very good autumn," he said. "It is a very good life," she said. He looked at her sideways with that small, warm smile that was the full version in compressed form. "Yes," he said, "it is." In the spring of 1883, Thomas received a letter from the Austin Academy for Natural Sciences offering him a place in their junior program, which accepted students of exceptional promise between the ages of 12 and 14. He was 11, and the letter noted his age with frank surprise and said that his application materials, the 3 months of naturalist's journals Eliza had helped him compile and present, with their detailed observations and careful illustrations, demonstrated a degree of scientific rigor that warranted an early invitation. He could begin the following September. James and Eliza sat on the porch the evening Thomas showed them the letter, after the boy had gone to bed, and talked it through with the careful, responsible attention of people who take stewardship of a child's future seriously. The academy was in Austin, a 2-day journey by horse and coach. Thomas would board there during term. He would be 11 when he started, which was young, but he was in many ways mature beyond his years in ways that would serve him, and in others still very much a boy, which the academy accommodated. "He will be extraordinary there," Eliza said. "He is already extraordinary." "Yes," James said. He was looking at his hands, turning his hat brim in a slow, habitual circle the way he did when he was thinking through something with effort. "It is the right thing for him, I know that." She looked at him. "You are going to miss him terribly." He looked up at her and smiled, an honest smile with a bit of ache in it. "Considerably." She took his hand, the one that was turning the hat brim. He stilled and looked at their joined hands and then back at her. "He will come home for summers," she said. "And he will write. You know he will write. He writes everything down." James laughed, low and warm. "He will send me highly detailed scientific observations about the Austin ecosystem." "And we will read every word," she said. "And you will write back and ask questions about all of it, and he will be delighted." He squeezed her hand once firmly. "Thank you," he said quietly. She did not ask what he was thanking her for. She understood that it was for all of it, for sitting here on this porch with him, for building this life with him, for being a person whose presence made the hard parts of things easier to hold. She understood it because she felt it too. Thomas spent the summer of 1883 preparing for Austin, with a combination of intense excitement and carefully managed anxiety that he expressed primarily by cataloging every living thing on the Broken Spur Ranch in exhaustive detail. By the end of August, he had filled 2 new journals and identified 7 species of prairie grass he had not previously recorded. He left for Austin on a bright September morning with a leather trunk, his journals, his collection of stones and specimens carefully wrapped in cloth, and the piece of rose quartz Eliza had given back to him when Henry was born, which he kept in his coat pocket as a talisman. James drove him to the stagecoach station in Redemption. Eliza stood on the boarding house porch because she had run an errand to Mrs. Hawthorne's that morning, and it was easier to say goodbye here in the familiar place. Thomas hugged her with both arms, fiercely and without self-consciousness, the way a child hugs someone they love completely. "I am going to write to you about everything," he said. "The birds in Austin are different. I want every detail," she said. She held him at arm's length and looked at him, this boy with his gray-green eyes and his precise, earnest mind and his rose quartz in his pocket, and felt the full, complicated tenderness of loving a child who is not your own blood and is yours entirely anyway. "You are going to be extraordinary, you already are." He nodded seriously, accepting the statement as information rather than flattery. Then he straightened his hat and picked up his trunk and went a climb aboard the coach. James came to stand beside her as the coach rolled out of town, and they stood together and watched it go until it was a small dusty shape in the distance and then nothing at all. She took his hand. He held it. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. He meant it, and he also meant the other thing that it contained, the love and the ache of loving someone well enough to let them go toward what they are meant for. She understood both meanings. She always did with him by now. By 1884, Henry was 3 years old and in possession of an extremely detailed understanding of the ranch's operational priorities as they pertain to his personal preferences, which included riding on his father's horse as frequently as possible, being read to twice daily at minimum, and following Calvin the ranch hand through every task of the day with the focused intensity of an apprentice. He was a warm, solid, talkative child who had inherited Eliza's dark eyes and James's steadiness, and some unique combination of them both that produced a child who asked as many questions as Thomas had at his age, but was more interested in the practical answers, not "Why does the hawk hunt that way?" but "How does the hawk hunt that way? What does it do with its wings? Can we try that?" Thomas wrote from Austin every 2 weeks without fail. His letters were precisely and beautifully written, and contained exactly the detailed scientific observations he had promised, along with news of his studies and his fellow students and the Austin professors who, he noted with some satisfaction, did not think questions were excessive. He came home for summer, and the house was full again, and they rode the ranch together, the 4 of them, on the long summer evenings, Henry up before James on the big horse, and Thomas pointing out flora and fauna from horseback, with the focused enthusiasm of a boy whose education had given his natural gifts new language and structure. The summer of 1885 brought news that the railroad line was coming through the county, 15 miles south of Redemption. James and Thaddeus Cole and the other ranchers in the area spent several heated evenings at the church discussing what this would mean for the cattle business, whether it was good news or complicated news, whether the access to wider markets outweighed the changes it would bring in terms of land prices and population, and the slow transformation of frontier territory into something more settled, more regulated, less itself. James came home from those meetings with the furrow in his brow that meant he was carrying something heavy, and Eliza talked it through with him over the kitchen table with the lamp burning low and Henry already long asleep and the night outside full of crickets. "The land is going to change," he said. "Everything changes when the railroad comes." "Yes," she said, "but the land was always going to change. The question is what we make of it." He looked at her across the table. "You always do that," he said. Do what? Find the thing inside the complicated thing that is manageable. He said it not as a criticism, but as an observation of someone genuinely impressed by a capability he values. I have been worrying about this for a month and you found the useful part in about 30 seconds, she laughed. I have been listening to you worry about it for a month. I had a head start. He reached across the table and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear with careful fingers, a gesture so familiar and so deliberately tender that she felt it all the way through, the way she always did when he was deliberate about the gentle things. What would I do without you? He said quietly. Not a question. Considerably more worrying, she said. In the spring of 1886, Eliza found herself telling James again that they were going to have a child. She told him on the porch at the same time of evening she had told him about Henry, which was not deliberate but which was somehow fitting. He went still in the same way, concentrated and deep, and then he pulled her against him and held her there in the May evening with the last light fading over the plains, and she could feel him breathing, slow and full. A girl this time, perhaps, she said, into his shoulder. Perhaps, he said. She could hear the smile in his voice. The daughter arrived in November of 1886, early on a cold morning when the first frost had silvered the grass, and the sky was a pure, pale gray. She was smaller than Henry had been, with a head full of dark hair and a look of composed assessment in her newly opened eyes that made both James and Eliza laugh, each for the same reason. It was an expression they recognized. They named her Clara Rose Calloway. Rose for the rose quartz that had traveled from the broken Spur Creek bed to the Austin Academy, and was at this very moment in Thomas's coat pocket 600 miles away, which Eliza would explain to Clara when Clara was old enough, and which she already knew Clara would appreciate. Henry received his sister with a magnanimity that was somewhat theatrical and entirely genuine. He was 5 years old and had developed very clear ideas about how things should be managed, and a sister fit neatly into his understanding of how a proper ranch should be run. He appointed himself her protector with a seriousness that made both his parents work hard to keep their expressions composed, and he sat beside her cradle on the first evening and told her, in a low, instructive voice, that this was the Broken Spur Ranch, and they did things a particular way here, and he would show her everything she needed to know. Thomas came home for Christmas that year and held Clara with the careful, precise attention of someone who has studied living systems and is now encountering a new one, and said that she had extraordinary grip strength for her age, which was his way of saying she was perfect, and they all understood it. The new year of 1887 opened clear and cold and full. The ranch was prospering. The railroad access had proven, as Eliza had suggested was possible, to be good news, opening wider markets for the cattle and bringing a small but meaningful increase in prosperity to the area. Redemption had grown slightly, with 3 new families and a new physician who had set up practice in the building next to the dry goods store. The new schoolhouse held 22 students now. James had put in a proper kitchen garden the previous spring with raised beds and an irrigation channel that ran from the creek, and Eliza had planted it with vegetables and a border of the wild prairie flowers that grew along the creek banks. And by the summer it was both productive and beautiful in the unsentimental, functional way. She liked best beautiful because it was well-made and useful, not beautiful as ornament. She was standing in the garden on a warm afternoon in early spring of 1887, Clara on a blanket in the shade of the porch, Henry visible in the far pasture with Calvin and the cattle, when James came around the corner of the house and stopped, looking at her. She had been pulling weeds with the concentrated energy she brought to practical tasks, and her hair was coming loose from its pins and her hands were dirty, and she did not see him for a moment, and in that moment he simply watched her. When she looked up and saw him, she said, "You are staring." "I am," he agreed, entirely without embarrassment. She sat back on her heels and pushed the loose hair from her face with the back of her wrist. "I must look a complete state." He walked over and crouched down beside her in the garden dirt and looked at her with that direct, unhurried attention that still, after nearly 9 years of knowing him, hit her somewhere warm and central. "You look like you," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. She thought, not for the first time, about that evening on the hotel steps when she had told him she was not beautiful and he had laughed and told her he had eyes, didn't he? When she had expected pity or contradiction and had received instead simply the declaration of a man who looked at things clearly and reported what he saw. She thought about how long it had taken her to believe him. She thought about how entirely she believed him now. "James," she said. He said. "I believe you," she said. He looked at her with a slight questioning tilt. "About what you said, a long time ago," she gestured vaguely at her own face. "I believe you." He understood immediately. She saw it in his expression, the recognition, and behind it something quiet and satisfied and deep, like a knot that has been carefully and patiently worked loose over a very long time. He reached out and touched her jaw with his fingertips, the same gesture he had used on a hotel porch 9 years ago when the stars were out and the frontier was all around them. "Good," he said, quietly. The way he said the things that mattered most. She covered his hand with hers. The garden was warm around them, and the prairie stretched out beyond the fence line into the enormous Texas distance, and Clara was making small, contented sounds on her blanket in the shade, and somewhere in the far pasture, Henry was laughing at something Calvin had said. This was the life. Not the life she had come to Redemption to find, because she had not known this was possible. Not the life she had been told she was suited for, which had been a smaller, more diminished thing. The life that had arrived because she had walked off a stagecoach in a strange town with a cracked heart, and kept her spine straight and opened a schoolroom, and let herself be seen by someone who looked at things clearly. Thomas graduated from the Austin Academy for Natural Sciences in the spring of 1888, top of his program, with a commendation from his principal for his original research on the bird populations of the Edwards Plateau. He came home for the summer with 2 full trunks of books and specimens and journals, and spent June and July at the Broken Spur, which was both a homecoming and a kind of scientific reconnaissance. He had 3 years of ranch observations to revisit with new eyes. He was 14 now, growing into the long, precise, earnest young man he was going to be, with James's steadiness and his own particular brand of wonder that had always been entirely his. He sat with Eliza one evening on the porch while James was doing the last check of the cattle, with Clara asleep in her cradle inside and Henry long since in bed, and said, in the considering way of a boy who has been thinking about something for some time, "I want to go to university, proper university, in the East perhaps." "I know," she said. "James will say it is too far." He paused. "But I think he will also want me to go." "He wants whatever you are meant for," she said. "He always has." Thomas nodded slowly. "You have been good for him," he said. "Not that he was bad before, but you are good for him." He looked at her with those gray-green eyes that were James's eyes in a younger face. I think he was very alone before you came, and now he is not." She looked at the prairie evening with its long, declining light, and thought about a man who had rearranged his Saturday mornings to come into town at 9 o'clock. A man who had brought her wildflowers without ceremony and apple butter he had made himself. A man who had looked at her on a hotel porch and laughed with warm, astonished affection when she told him she was not beautiful, and then told her, with the total simplicity of someone stating an observable fact, that he had eyes, didn't he? "He is not alone now," she said, "and neither am I." Thomas went to the University of Texas when it opened its first proper year in 1883. No, he would be ready for it in a few years. It was already in operation. He applied to the University of Texas in Austin the following year and was accepted. And he went. And he sent letters every 2 weeks as he always had. And James read every word and wrote back long, considered replies that took him most of a Sunday afternoon to compose. And Eliza read both sides of the correspondence and felt the same thing every time. The particular fullness of watching love expressed in exactly the way the person doing the expressing was made to express it. Henry started at the Redemption Schoolhouse in the autumn of 1888. He was 8 years old, and he arrived on the first day with the careful dignity of someone who has been preparing for this for some time and is pleased to finally be here. He sat in the front row and watched Eliza at the chalkboard with an expression she recognized. She had seen it in the mirror occasionally, that absorbed, intent attention. He had her focus and James's patience, and some specific, unique version of both that was entirely his own. Clara took her first steps on a December morning in 1888, on the kitchen floor of the Broken Spur Ranch house, navigating with great determination from the leg of the kitchen table to the door frame, a distance of about 6 feet, which she crossed in 9 lurching, triumphant steps. James was there to see it, which was not always the case with these things because ranches did not pause for milestones, but he was there, and he picked her up at the door frame and held her up and said, "Look at you," with the same open, unguarded expression he had worn the morning Henry was born, and the morning of their wedding, and the morning Eliza had told him she believed him finally about what he saw when he looked at her. The years moved in the way that good years do, not slowly, not quickly, but fully, each one distinct and real and carrying its own particular weight and light. The drought of 1889 was less severe than the one in 1882, and they weathered it with the knowledge and the network they had built from the first one. The cattle market shifted in 1890, and James adapted with the same careful, considered pragmatism he brought to all of it. Redemption grew a little more and lost a little of its frontier rawness, and gained a little of the settled comfort that comes with permanence, and people were born and people died and children grew and the prairie remained, indifferent and magnificent. Thomas became a naturalist, as he had always intended. He conducted field research along the Pecos River in 1891 and sent Eliza a detailed letter about the bird species he was cataloging that included 12 careful drawings, and she put the letter in the wooden box under the bed where she kept the things that mattered most to her. He came home every summer and every Christmas without fail, and when he was home, the house was full of his particular kind of energy, that focused, precise enthusiasm that had once been expressed through rocks and feathers on a schoolhouse windowsill. Henry became, at 13, the kind of boy his father had been made into by the land, steady and capable and quietly perceptive, with a gift for understanding animals that made him a natural on the ranch. He also had an unexpected talent for drawing that he pursued with focused independence, covering the margins of his school exercises with detailed studies of horses and cattle, and the prairie landscape that made Eliza keep the exercises rather than burn them at the end of term. Clara was a girl of startling directness and enormous warmth, who by the age of 5 had organized the ranch dogs into a system that suited her, and was managing the kitchen garden with a proprietary confidence that James found privately, helplessly amusing. She had Eliza's wide mouth and James's steady eyes, and the specific, particular energy of someone who was going to make her corner of the world exactly what she wanted it to be. In the spring of 1892, James and Eliza sat on the porch one evening, the same porch, the same chairs, a different spring but the same smell of the prairie opening up after winter, and James said, out of a companionable quiet that had lasted a comfortable 10 minutes, "I want to add the east room." She looked at him. "To the house," he clarified. "A proper library. You have run out of shelf space." She looked at her hands. She had, in fact, run out of shelf space in a fairly dramatic fashion about 6 months prior, and had been managing the overflow with creative arrangements involving window ledges and trunks and the top of the armoire. "That would be practical," she said. "It would also be," he said, with the particular careful lightness he used for something that mattered to him deeply and that he was presenting as casual, "a place where the children can study when they are older, and where we can sit in the evenings." He paused. "I have been thinking about it for some time." She looked at him sideways. "How long?" "Since I noticed you rearranging the books on the window ledge for the third time." He was not quite smiling, but the expression was adjacent to it. "About 8 months." She laughed the full, unguarded laugh. "You are a very observant man. You are a woman worth observing," he said simply. She looked at him, and he looked back, and she felt, with the full, uncomplicated force of something that had only grown larger with time, the exact same thing she had felt on a hotel porch in 1878 when he had made her laugh without warning and told her, with absolute directness, that he had eyes. He did have eyes. He always had. And he had used them from the beginning to see her clearly, not the version she had been told she was, not the diminished, plain, unremarkable thing that Gerald Whitmore's careful neglect had built in her mind, but the actual Eliza, the one with the strong hands and the wide mouth and the schoolteacher's spine, and the laugh that arrived without permission when something genuinely delighted her. He had seen that woman from the first, and he had never once looked away. The East Room was built that summer, a proper extension of stone and timber that matched the original house, and had 2 large windows that caught the morning light, and a set of floor-to-ceiling shelves that Eliza filled with such immediate thoroughness that she had to order another set from the carpenter in redemption by autumn. The room became exactly what James had envisioned, a place of evening lamp light and quiet and books, where Henry drew in his notebooks at the desk, and Clara organized her various projects on the rug, and James sat in the chair by the east window, with the evening light falling across his hands and the ranch accounts or a newspaper. And Eliza read on the settee they had brought from the hotel when it was replaced, and the whole room was warm with the particular warmth of a family that has found its shape. In the evenings, sometimes, she would look up from her book and find him watching her, and she would hold his gaze, and there would be a moment of something between them that had no name and needed none. A recognition of this, all of this, the whole accumulated life of it, the prairie and the children and the years and each other, in a single wordless exchange that said everything. She was not a woman who believed she was beautiful, not in the way the magazines described it, not in the way that Gerald Whitmore had modeled it with his careless comparisons. She was something better than that. She was a woman who was loved specifically and completely, by a man who had looked at her with clear eyes from the beginning and seen exactly what was there, and who had been saying so, in one way and another, every day since. The 4th of July in 1893 was celebrated in Redemption with more ceremony than usual, because it was the town's 20th year of existence, and the whole community had organized a proper celebration with a parade down the main street and a picnic in the square and music in the evening. Eliza stood at the edge of the square in the afternoon sun with Clara on her hip and watched Henry and 2 friends run a race down the main street with the absolute, unencumbered speed of boys who have not yet learned to conserve their energy. And James stood beside her with his hand at the small of her back, the easy, habitual presence of someone who has been beside you long enough that absence would feel like a missing limb. Thomas was there. He had come home for the summer as he always did, though his summers were increasingly full of field work, and he stood on the other side of James in conversation with Thaddeus Cole, now an old man with a silver mustache gone fully white, about the water table changes he had been observing in his field research along the Pecos. His presence filled the space it always had, the precise, earnest energy of him, and James glanced at him occasionally, with the look he had always had for the boy love and pride, and the satisfaction of someone who has watched a thing grow into what it was meant to be and knows they had a part in it. Mrs. Hawthorne was there, older now, her silver hair gone fully white, still managing the boarding house with cheerful authority, still watching everything with those bright, clever eyes. She found Eliza at the picnic table and sat down beside her with a plate of food and said, with the directness she had always had, "I want you to know that I am very satisfied with how this turned out." Eliza looked at her with genuine affection. "How what turned out?" "All of it," Mrs. Hawthorne said. gesturing with a fork at the general landscape of the afternoon, the picnic, the family, the town, the whole improbable flourishing of the thing. You came off that stagecoach with a cracked heart and a leather satchel, and I thought, now here is a woman who has been made to believe wrong things about herself. And I thought, well, redemption is a good name for a town because it ought to be good for something. Eliza laughed. You thought all that after knowing me for 3 minutes. I am a perceptive woman, Mrs. Hawthorne said without false modesty. And I was right. You were, Eliza said. Mrs. Hawthorne patted her hand once briskly and went back to her food. James came and sat beside Eliza on the bench, Clara having been transferred to the capable arms of one of the Cole grandchildren, and he was carrying 2 cups of lemonade, and he handed her one, and they sat in the afternoon shade and watched the celebration, Henry still running somewhere, Thomas talking with old Thaddeus, Clara visible at the far edge of the square in animated negotiation with the Cole granddaughter about something that appeared to require counting on both their fingers. Good day, James said. Very good day, she agreed. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said in the low, easy voice he used for the things that were simply true, I am glad you came here. She turned to look at him. His profile was familiar to her in every detail, the line of his jaw, the scar along his left eyebrow, the gray-green eyes that were looking at the celebration with quiet contentment. 15 years of looking at this face, and she was still, occasionally and without warning, struck by the specific fact of him. By the reality that this was the person who had stood with her through all of it, who had chosen her with complete deliberateness, and every day since confirmed that choice with his presence and his attention and his patient, steady love. So am I, she said. James. She said his name the way she always said it, simply, with the full weight of what it meant, which was considerable. He turned to look at her, and the afternoon light was warm and the sounds of redemption's celebration surrounded them, and he looked at her the way he had always looked at her, with those clear, direct, unreserved eyes, seeing exactly what was there and finding it more than sufficient. She had come to this country small and cracked. She had arrived in a strange town on a dusty afternoon with a cracked heart and the accumulated damage of being told, over and over and in various ways, that she was less than what she was. And she had found in a dry goods store on a Tuesday morning a man who looked at her and saw clearly, and who had told her on a hotel porch under a sky full of stars that he had eyes, and had meant it in every way. He had eyes, and he had used them, and what he had seen in her had been the truth all along. The evening came in warm and slow over redemption, the way summer evenings do in Texas, long and golden and generous, as if the day is in no hurry to become night. The music started in the square, someone's fiddle and someone else's guitar, a loose, easy sound that brought people onto the grass to dance in the warm air. Henry abandoned his race and appeared at his father's side with the information that there was dancing and could they please, and James lifted him onto his feet and said yes, and Henry ran back to the square with the joy of a boy whose evening has just improved significantly. James extended his hand to Eliza, palm up, in the uncomplicated invitation of someone who knows the answer and is simply completing the gesture. She put her hand in his. They danced on the grass in the Redemption Town Square in the summer evening of 1893, with the fiddle going and the stars beginning to show in the east and Clara asleep in Mrs. Hawthorne's capable arms at the edge of the square, and Henry dancing with cheerful incompetence in a cluster of other children, and Thomas watching from the side with a fond, slightly amused expression that was entirely his uncle's. James held her hand and kept his other hand at her waist and moved with the unhurried ease of someone dancing because it gives him pleasure, not because anyone is watching, and she moved with him, her hand warm in his, the music going through the summer air, the whole of their life around them in the square and the streets and the plains beyond. She thought about a stagecoach and a leather satchel and a cracked mirror above a wash basin. She thought about a man leaning against a door frame in a dry goods store with sage-rain eyes. She thought about a porch and a kiss, and a proposal on horseback above the silver curve of the Llano River. She thought about a boy with rose quartz in his pocket, and a hawk's nest on the East Ridge, and 2 trunks of research journals. She thought about a little boy telling her she was remarkable, and a little girl marching on determined legs across a kitchen floor. She thought about every ordinary, extraordinary morning of the past 15 years, every conversation at the kitchen table, and every ride across the Golden Plains, and every evening in the lamplight of the new East Room. And she thought that she had been wrong about herself for a very long time, and she had been right about this for every moment of those 15 years, which was by far the more important of the 2 truths. James looked at her as they danced in the warm evening light with the same eyes he had always had, seeing the same woman he had always seen. "What are you thinking?" he said. She smiled, the full, unguarded version. "That you were right," she said, "from the beginning." "You were right." He raised his eyebrows slightly, a question. "You have eyes," she said, "and you use them well." He understood immediately, as he always did. His expression moved through something warm and deep, and then settled into the quiet, contented certainty of someone who has known something for a long time and is glad to hear it confirmed. He pulled her a little closer, the way you pull something closer when it belongs to you and you are not in any hurry to let it go. "Yes," he said simply. "I do." The music went on. The stars came out, the whole brilliant freight of them across the Texas sky. Somewhere in the square Henry was laughing, and Thomas was watching, and Clara was sleeping. Redemption's people danced in the summer evening of 1893, and the prairie lay all around them in its vast, indifferent beauty, and the broken spur waited east of town in the darkness with its stone walls and its east room full of books, and its kitchen garden and the creek where rose quartz sat in the bed of the water, and the red-tailed hawks were still, after all this time, building their nest in the cleft of the East Ridge. She had come here to start over. She had found instead that this was where she had always been heading, without knowing it, through all the years of being made small and all the days of keeping her spine straight anyway. This town, this man, this life, these children, this full and complicated and deeply ordinary, extraordinary existence on the Texas frontier. This was what had been waiting at the end of the road when the stagecoach stopped. James Calloway held his wife in the warm evening air and looked at her with the same clear, true eyes he had always had, and she looked back at him with everything she was, and neither of them looked away. The fiddle played on. The stars were out. And the life they had built together, stone by stone and day by day in the long golden light of the Texas plains, was exactly as solid and exactly as beautiful as the man who had first looked at her with those eyes and said, simply and forever, "I have eyes, don't I?" It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.